Hello everyone and welcome to this video tutorial on how to apply the law on insanity and automatism to a mini scenario. In this tutorial we're going to be looking at John in the army mini scenario. We're going to recap the law on insanity and automatism, noticing the overlap between the two defences. And we're going to look at how we would use that idea structure to get a really nice answer to the question. Let's start by looking at the scenario that we've been given. So the situation is this: John began to experience hallucinations during which he thought he was back in the army. Eventually, he was diagnosed as having a small, non-malignant brain tumour. John went on a shopping trip in a supermarket where the bright overhead lighting began to affect him. John thought a shopper was an enemy soldier and struck him savagely with a tin of beans. And you're being asked to discuss whether John has any defence or defences to the battery on a shopper. Now, we know, because that's the topic of this tutorial and also the heading here, you already know that there's potentially insanity and automatism in this mini scenario. But you're not being told in the actual question that they want insanity or automatism. So if you were in the exam, you would have had to work out that those two defences were relevant just from reading the scenario. Now, I'm hoping that from reading this, two particular things jumped out at you. Firstly, the fact that John has a small malignant brain tumour, so I'm going to highlight that as I would in the exam. And the second thing was that this overhead lighting began to affect him. So when we're looking at this scenario, he's attacked someone with a tin of beans, but they're not wanting you to apply the crime on that. They're just asking you for the defences. So you wouldn't have to apply battery here, you just have to do the defences. So there's two issues: the brain tumour and this lighting. Now, I think before we go into any more on this, it'd be useful just to recap what the law is on insanity and automatism, so hopefully this situation makes a bit more sense. Start by recapping insanity, and this is going to be a really quick recap because we don't have time to go through it all in this one tutorial. What I do urge you to do is to go away and watch the previous video tutorial in which I did all of the law on insanity and automatism, breaking down all the cases, looking at the definitions. Watch that tutorial again so that it's all fresh in your mind before you try to apply the law. But quick recap here. Insanity, if you recall, comes from the ancient case of Macnaghten from 1843. And because it's come from this old case, insanity is a bit of an antiquated, old-fashioned defence. The language is quite problematic, but nonetheless, these are the rules that we still have to follow. So Macnaghten listed the three requirements for a defence of insanity. Firstly, our defendant was suffering from a defect of reason. Secondly, this was as a result of a disease of the mind. And thirdly, that this caused the defendant not to know the nature or quality of his act, or that what he was doing was wrong. So defect of reason was discussed in the case of Clark, where they said that it had to be something more than just temporary absent-mindedness. It had to be some sort of more permanent defect of reason, of thought process. And that defect must be as a result of a disease of the mind. Now, that's a really confusing, misleading phrase, if you remember, because really what this actually means is any disease which affects the mind. This phrasing makes it look like it's just mental disorders, but strangely for insanity, it's usually physical diseases that have an impact on the mind that actually lead to a defence of insanity. So in Kemp, it was arteriosclerosis, hardening of the arteries, which meant that blood wasn't travelling to the brain with oxygen quickly enough, that led him to black out. So that was a physical condition which affected his mind. Epilepsy, Again, a disease which people wouldn't necessarily expect to be insanity, but it is classed as a disease of the mind because it affects the mind. And then we get onto the sticky situation of diabetes. Remember, there's a big overlap between insanity and automatism here. And that's why often, if you think insanity is relevant to a scenario, you should think, could it also be automatism? Because there is that overlap. So in Hennessy, it was held that if a diabetic doesn't take their drugs and they black out, then that's due to the internal disease of the mind. Whereas if they take their drugs and don't eat and go into a diabetic state and black out, that would be automatism, and that comes from quick. So, really confusing, not very logical, but that's the law that we have to accept. So diabetic, no drugs, insanity; diabetic, drugs, automatism. And sleepwalking can be insanity if it's caused from a disease within the body of the mind. If you were hit on the head with a stone, that would be automatism. So again, you can see that overlap between the two defences. And once we've established there's a defect of reason caused by a disease of the mind, we have to decide, does that mean he doesn't know the nature or quality of his act, i.e. doesn't know what he's physically doing, thinks he's strangling a snake when it's actually a human? Or does he know what he's physically doing, but he doesn't know what he was doing was wrong, illustrated in Windle? Okay, so there's a recap of insanity. Let's recap automatism then. So automatism is much more straightforward than insanity. There's only two requirements: that the actions of the defendant were completely involuntary, and in AG's ref it said that there must be a complete destruction of voluntary control. So if they've still got some control, it won't be automatism. And the cause must be external. And we touched on that with the case of Quick, where you've got that overlap with the diabetes. And there's also, if it's self-induced, we've got Bailey there, if you remember. But there wasn't diabetes in our scenario that we're looking at. So we need to bear in mind, was it involuntary? Was there an external cause? Okay, so now those two defences are refreshed in our minds, hopefully. Let's go back and look at the situation for John. So looking back at John then, firstly, we've got this non-malignant brain tumour. Now, this could be insanity. Hopefully you're thinking that now because it's an internal cause. It's a physical condition, a brain tumour, but presumably that might be affecting his mind, causing him to have these hallucinations. And that's inside him, insanity, whereas the overhead lighting has started to affect him. Could he possibly argue it was the lighting that has caused him to attack this guy? Now, if it's the lighting, that's outside of him, that's external, that's automatism. So an internal cause and an external cause. So we need to be applying insanity here on the brain tumour and automatism on this lighting. And on my next slide, I've got how we would use the idea structure to do that effectively. So if you've got a situation where you've got possibly insanity and automatism together, which you often will do if there's an internal external cause, as we've got with our John scenario, or if you've got diabetes, you're going to have to do both because it could be one or the other. This is how you would set it out. So as always, we use idea. We identify, define, explain, and apply. So you would start by saying your defendant, in our case, John, might be able to rely on the defense of insanity or automatism when he hits the shopper with the beans. And for us, we don't know yet whether it's insanity or automatism, but we know that because of the brain tumour and because of the lighting, he might be able to make those two arguments. We then define the defences that we've said it might be. So we've said insanity or automatism. So define the three requirements of insanity from McNaughton. and then define the two requirements of automatism. And then we explain. So you're going to have quite a chunky explanation here because you're going to be explaining insanity and you're going to explain automatism. So start off with insanity, use McNaughton and explain the three requirements using all of your cases. And once you've explained insanity, you're going to explain automatism, the two requirements, again with your cases. And then you're going to apply the three elements of insanity to your character, and then apply the two elements of automatism, and then conclude. Make sure you do one defence at a time. Don't jump between them because you'll get yourself in a muddle. So talk about the possibility of insanity, apply all three elements, and then talk about the possibility of automatism, apply both, and then conclude with which one you think's more likely in the situation. I've done a bullet point mark scheme for the John scenario, which I'm going to show you now. So this is my bullet point answer to the John scenario. It's a little bit small, so you might want to pause the video here so you can have a good read of it. Mine's very listy, bullet pointy, so I could fit it on one slide. As always, you must be writing in full sentences, explaining your cases. So we're going to start by identifying. John might be able to plead the defences of automatism and insanity in relation to the attack with the beans. We then define it. So insanity has three requirements: defect of reason, disease of the mind, so they don't know nature or quality or know that it was wrong. Automatism has two requirements: it was completely involuntary, there was an external cause. I'm then going to E, and I'm going to explain insanity using my cases, and then I'm going to explain automatism using my cases. Now, as I've said, mine's very listy, so I could fit it on here, but I would expect you to explain these to the examiner. So when you're talking about disease of the mind, say this is very misleading, it just means any condition which affects the mind. So in Kemp, arteriosclerosis was enough. In Sullivan, epilepsy was a disease of the mind. In Hennessy, diabetes was a disease of the mind, but had it been caused by drugs related to diabetes, this would have been external automatism quick. So go through and explain it all fully. Once you've done that, we're then into our application. And I'm going to apply insanity, and then when I'm done with that, I'm going to apply automatism. So I've said John might be able to plead insanity because of the brain tumour. So he's got a defect of reason because he believes a shopper is an enemy, and obviously that's not a normal way of thinking. John has a disease of the mind because the tumour affects his mind, and you could compare that to the case of Kemp. And John doesn't know the nature and quality of his acts because he thinks he's hitting an enemy soldier when actually it's a shopper. So he meets all three elements of insanity, he can plead insanity. But insanity is not really a defence that people like to plead. Who wants to be found not guilty by reason of insanity? It's not ideal. So we consider the other option to him. John might also be able to plead automatism because the lights affect him and they are external. The action is involuntary, but it's unclear whether he lost all control. So remember, for automatism, we need a complete destruction of voluntary control. If he's still able to control himself, he'll lose the defence. So it's more likely in this situation that John is going to plead insanity successfully, although he would prefer automatism, because remember, automatism is a complete defence, so that's the defence he'd prefer, because then he's not guilty of anything. Whereas here he's not guilty by reason of insanity and could potentially be given a hospital order or something like that, which he isn't going to want. So that's the application there, and you can see I've dealt with one, then the other. I've not jumped between the two of them. And you can see that I've gone through each requirement of insanity in order and each requirement of automatism in order.